folks in the crypto community, but that's actually not the only issue that the SEC deals with. And in fact, it's probably, in terms of capital, it's probably the smallest piece. So they're going to talk about private versus public markets disclosure. They're going to talk about public company disclosures. They're going to talk about enforcement, and they're going to talk about a limitations period that the Supreme Court weighed in on a couple of years ago. And then finally, if you look at the memo they provided, that the House committee provided, the Financial Services Committee provided, at that point they'll talk about cryptocurrency. As far as what we're going to hear, my suspicion is we're going to hear a lot of what we've already heard before, which is that applicable law applies. If you look at the SEC's both their enforcement actions, and you look at the things that they've written, the digital asset framework, the report on the Dow, we've basically seen their view as new technology is cool, but you got to comply with securities law. I suppose it's possible that we'll hear from Commissioner Peirce, who's been fairly outspoken on this, that certain areas of the law could use updating, which is obviously for Congress to do. The other part of your question, I think, was what would we like?
Yeah, what would we like to hear from them?
I mean, you guys tell me. It's hard to. There isn't really a monolithic cryptocurrency community. I think some people would like to see certain kinds of exemptions for crypto-related crowd sales. Other people, so maybe a lower dollar threshold. Other people might like to see the law change so that securities laws don't apply in the same way to crypto assets, and maybe you'd have consumer protection laws apply. I think some people in the so-called cryptocurrency community would say that the law works just fine as it is. So it's hard to know what sort of monolithic desire there is, if any.
Fair enough. Now we know also from that memorandum that one of the topics they're going to be talking about is Libra, so Facebook's digital asset that's about to be rolled out sometime in 2020. Again, a range of opinions on what the community wants to hear, but from indications we've seen so far, at least from the politician side, they're not big fans.
No, they're not. It's fairly hard to find somebody, I think, on the Hill these days who's a fan of anything that Facebook wants to do. There were some notable exceptions in the last hearing. Some people who spoke of the need to support innovation, but I'm sure that that will be a topic that will be somewhat contentious as well.
Absolutely. Asher, I'm turning to you. One thing that everybody's dying to hear and gain more information about, and really rests at the SEC's door, is this decision regarding Bitcoin ETFs. Right, and that's already made headlines this week with Bitwise, right. And hopefully we'll continue to do so today.
Yeah, certainly so. And the Bitwise recently came out stating, some clear clarifying goals that it thinks are critical to developing the space. They're talking about the maturing and efficiency of spot trading, talking about institutional grade custody. I mean, these are key things that Bitwise says that they think will be able to make an ETF on the cards for now, given their upcoming decision that the SEC will have to make on whether they're going to approve the Bitwise ETF later on next month or so. It's going to be an interesting time to see that. That's not specifically what they're here to touch on today, but obviously the views that they say now, whether it be regarding cryptocurrencies as a whole, whether it be regarding Libra specifically, the notions that come out of this representation, this very public hearing, are likely to impact the way markets perceive the SEC going forward. Not to say that a decision on an ETF is going to be made imminently, right. But certainly those perceptions, particularly, of course, when we're talking about the makeup of the SEC, where we've got some established views, particularly Chairman Clayton and Commissioner Robert Jackson are seen as tending towards being anti sort of cryptocurrencies, or more inclined away from taking regulatory action on cryptocurrencies. Hester Peirce and Elad Roisman being seen as more pro on the other side of that, and then the relatively untested and newest member of the commission, Alison Heron-Lee, who a recent appointee. Her views are not yet fully known around crypto, and this could be a chance to see what comes out of that.
Now, Stephen, back to you. You familiar with the Bitwise report and their claims of showing how progress has been made over the last year or the last 2 years towards satisfying some of the issues that the SEC appear to have with approving a Bitcoin ETF?
Sure.
And now, so do you agree with their findings? Do you think we have, or the community or the industry has made steps toward easing the minds of regulators?
Honestly, I think that you will hear from regulators that there's still a ways to go.
Which is what we've been hearing.
I think that markets go up and down significantly, often without any sort of relation to knowable or understandable external events. Custody still remains a thorny problem. I don't think we're necessarily any closer to resolution of the issues that Clayton in particular has articulated. Which is that an ETF would be a good or a bad thing. I just, if you're asking, are we going to hear anything today that provides a timeline or sort of more proximity to resolution of those issues, I'm skeptical. I suppose it could happen. I don't have regulator telepathy, though.
No. Few do. But on that point of custody, I mean, we saw a relatively big move as well this week. I'm talking, of course, about the launch of Bakkt and their Bitcoin futures trading. Does that lend any more credence to this industry or to investment in it?
Sure. I mean, it's happening. Take SoFi, for example. You can now, they sent out an email to customers this past week. You can now buy, I believe you can now buy Bitcoin using SoFi, which is a fairly well-established consumer lender and financial services company. I have always been, well, for quite some time, I've been long-term bullish on Bitcoin. I remain that way. I think the markets are coming around. It's maturing. I just don't know that we're necessarily any closer to resolving issues that have stood in the way from the SEC's view of approving a Bitcoin ETF. I don't think that happens for a while. Doesn't mean that it won't eventually.
All right. Thanks, Stephen. One other topic that's worth noting. So last time Block TV covered an event from the House of Representatives, it was when David Marcus was there to testify and kind of explain and lay out Libra's plan. That was a few months ago. They've also made some steps along the way. Hold on, I'm getting word. Okay, we have some live images from DC.
Without
now,
objection,
from
the chair is authorized to
Financial,
declare a recess of the committee at any time.
So, Stephen, we're going to let you go now. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to go live now to the House of Representatives in the United States. Hear what they're saying there now.
Good morning. I want to welcome back Chairman Clayton and welcome Commissioners Jackson, Peirce, Roisman, and Lee to this important hearing on the SEC's role in U.S. capital markets. This is the first time since 2007 that all 5 commissioners of the Securities and Exchange Commission have testified before the Financial Services Committee. I believe it is important for the committee to hear testimony from each of the commissioners, including its chairman, because they each hold a vote on important regulatory and enforcement matters, and they each hold unique views that the committee should be aware of. This is especially important since the SEC is not fulfilling its mission as Wall Street's cop. Key rules like the Volcker Rule have been rolled back, while rules to implement other important reforms on issues like executive compensation, which Congress enacted back in 2010 as part of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, remain incomplete. Other regulations, such as the SEC's so-called regulation best interests, fail to protect retirement savers from unscrupulous financial advisors. It is also clear that our existing securities laws are not working, and there are loopholes in the laws that corporate insiders are taking advantage of. For example, executives are enriching themselves by buying or selling securities in their own companies during the 8K trading gap, which is a 4-day gap after a major corporate event before the company is required to notify the public and investors of that event. Corporate executives are also using stock buybacks to line their own pockets rather than giving their companies pay raises or investing in their companies. In addition, a court decision in Kokesh versus SEC limited the SEC's ability to recover wrongful gains from fraudsters like Bernie Madoff and return them to harmed investors. I believe that the SEC needs stronger tools to protect investors and punish bad actors. Members of this committee have introduced a number of bills to strengthen the Commission and our securities laws, and a number of these bills have passed this committee or the full House. Today, we will have the opportunity to hear directly from the commissioners on these important measures. In addition, I'm very concerned about Facebook's plan to create a digital currency, Libra, and digital wallet, Calibra. It appears that Facebook is working to create a new global financial system that is intended to rival the U.S. dollar. I and other Democrats on the committee have called for Facebook to halt their plans until regulators in Congress have an opportunity to examine these issues and take action. Today, I hope to hear what steps the SEC has taken to ensure that Libra is appropriately and rigorously regulated. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding today's hearing, and I appreciate Chairman Clayton and the gang here joining you today. Interesting that the whole commission is here. The SEC has a three-part mission: to protect investors, maintain fair and orderly and efficient markets, and third, facilitate capital formation. Now, all three pillars of the SEC's mission are critical, but I believe the first two pillars, protecting investors and maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, are encapsulated in that third pillar, capital formation. For without capital formation, the other two could not exist. And that means that if you have no market to regulate, then people don't have the opportunity to invest. Without markets for retail investors to participate in, there would be no need for investor protection. So we need to help investors by focusing on policies that make our markets stronger, more attractive, and more competitive, not add regulatory costs and weaken them. We don't have to look any further than the impact of mandatory disclosure after mandatory disclosure on a company's compliance costs. Real costs, those are real costs borne by real investors, making it more onerous and expensive to be public companies. Companies heavily burdened by costs will choose to stay in the private markets, ultimately depriving retail investors of choices and opportunities in the public markets. To that end, I'm glad that the SEC chairman, under Chairman Clayton's leadership, is focused on long overdue reforms that focus on capital formation initiatives that benefit Main Street investors. The SEC's renewed commitment to revitalizing our public capital markets through increased capital formation could not come at a more appropriate time and more crucial time. When considering publicly traded companies in which to invest, American investors have roughly half the number of companies that they did compared to 20 years ago. To quote Chairman Clayton, the steady decline in the number of public companies in the U.S. is simply, quote, not good. It's a nice understatement. I share Chairman Clayton's concern. The decline of our public markets is a troubling trend for our country's competitiveness and for American investors, and for retirement savings as well. The solution to this crucial problem is to focus on policies that will make companies want to go public and preserve options for raising much-needed capital, all of which will lead to increased competitiveness and more investment opportunities for everyday investors to grow their savings. I'd like to commend the Commission for their efforts to improve capital formation for smaller companies, particularly by re-examining the exempt offering regulatory framework. Many of these exemptions were modified or created by the Jobs Act of 2012, a landmark bipartisan piece of legislation that has had a major impact on capital markets and small businesses. Now it's time for the SEC to revisit these private offering exemptions to streamline and improve the regulatory framework to better promote capital formation and grow investment opportunities. One exemption that warrants modernization is the crowdfunding exemption. My original crowdfunding bill, which was included in the Jobs Act, was only a few pages long, 11 pages, in fact. I appreciate the SEC and their hardworking staff creating 685 pages worth of regulation around those 11 pages. The absurdity of this I point out a number of times since then, so you've given me at least the rhetorical value of talking about the burden of SEC regulation, making an exemption and a public law completely meaningless because of the impact and the cost. So I encourage the SEC to continue its efforts to expand investor access to all companies and to maintain its focus on reducing regulatory barriers that discourage companies from going or staying in our public markets. Stronger public markets translate to more economic growth and greater opportunity for everyday American investors to grow their savings and reach their goals of homeownership, retirement, or simply a better way of life. Now, in conclusion, we'll hear a lot of doom and gloom today. It is not all doom and gloom. The markets now appear healthier in the last 2 years. Investment opportunities are better now than they have been in recent years. I think there's a lot that is praiseworthy of the SEC's approach and how the market has responded to that. I look forward to your testimony and the questions today.
I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, Mrs. Maloney, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing and for inviting all 5 commissioners. The SEC has been active on issues such as cryptocurrency, market structure, and corporate governance. But by far, the most important action the SEC has taken was in June, when they finalized Regulation Best Interest, or Reg B1. This rule was intended to raise the standard of conduct for brokers and offer investment advice to retail investors. Unfortunately, I believe the rule was far too weak and did not raise the standard for brokers nearly enough. And to make it worse, the SEC also weakened the fiduciary standard for investment advisors, which was completely unnecessary and goes against the SEC's mission of protecting investors. So I'll be interested to hear from the Commission about why they chose this path, and I yield back. Thank you.
I want to welcome today's distinguished panel from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Commissioner Robert J. Jackson, Jr., who has served on the Commission since January 2018. Commissioner Jackson came to the Commission from New York University School of Law. Commissioner Hester M. Peirce, who has also served on the Commission since January 2018. Prior to joining the Commission, Commissioner Peirce had a post at the Mercator Center at George Mason University. Commissioner Elad L. Roisman, who has served on the Commission since September 2018, and who prior to joining the Commission served as Chief Counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. Commissioner Allison Herron Lee, who has served on the Commission since July 2019. Commissioner Lee has served for over a decade in various roles in the SEC, and most recently has written, lectured, and taught classes on financial regulation and corporate law internationally. And finally, Chairman Jay Clayton, who has served on the Commission since January 2017. Prior to joining the Commission, Chairman Clayton was a partner at Sullivan & Cromwell and was a member of the firm's management committee. Welcome all. Before recognizing you for your testimony, I understand Chairman Chayton has a brief administrative statement. So without objection, Chairman Clayton, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry and members of the committee. Before my fellow commissioners and I each provide our opening statements, I'd like to give our usual disclaimer, which is that each of us will be providing our own views and remarks, which do not represent those of the SEC or our fellow commissioners. A few other administrative statements. I'd like to note that although all 5 of us are here before you this morning, this is not a meeting of the commission under the statute known as the Sunshine Act. And as a result, we plan to be mindful to avoid deliberating on business before the agency. We are also sensitive to the potential appearance of prejudgment. This means that although we may offer our views and share our concerns about general issues, we will avoid making a determination during this hearing about the course of action that the Commission should or will take about any particular matter. As with our usual practice, we will keep an open mind and look forward to reviewing a fully developed record before making our determinations. Also, consistent with longstanding Commission practices, we would not expect to comment on pending litigation or enforcement actions. Thank you, Chairwoman Waters.
Thank you, Chairman Clayton. For purposes of testimony, each of you will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. At that time, I would ask you to wrap up your You will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony, both the witnesses and the committee members' time. Commissioner Jackson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. It is my great honor to be joining my colleagues to testify before you on our task at the Securities and Exchange Commission, protecting ordinary American investors. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude for the special privilege of working with the tremendous SEC staff that we work with every day. I have learned a great deal from them, and everything we do and we'll discuss today is possible only because of their tremendous public service. Now, Chairwoman Waters, before I joined the SEC, my work in government as a teacher and as a researcher focused on the gaps in our securities laws that allow corporate insiders to spend shareholder money to advance their own interests rather than those of investors. Because this committee is right now considering legislation that could address some of those gaps, I want to identify 3 areas where, in my view, doing so would be especially critical for investors. First, our disclosure rules have not kept up with the pace of today's markets. Specifically, SEC rules give public companies 4 days before they must notify the market about market-moving business developments on what is known as our Form 8K. A study I released before joining the Commission provided evidence that corporate insiders often trade during this gap between key corporate events and when our rules require that event to be revealed to the public. I am grateful that this committee has taken up bipartisan legislation that would close that gap and give investors the level playing field they so deeply deserve. Second, our rules incentivize corporate insiders to pursue stock buybacks that maximize executive pay but make no sense for ordinary investors. In a speech last year, I provided evidence that executives engage in significant sales of their company's stock after announcing a buyback. And I expanded upon that work in a letter to Senator Van Hollen this spring, showing that when insiders sell into a stock buyback, their company performs worse in the weeks after the buyback occurs. SEC rules should not incentivize buybacks that allow insiders to cash out but don't make long-run sense for ordinary buy-and-hold American investors. And finally, we should consider giving investors much more transparency into how public companies spend their money on politics. A significant amount of corporate political spending is not disclosed under the law we have today, since public companies can and do give investor money to intermediaries that do not disclose their donors. Indeed, a study I published in 2013 showed that just 8 intermediaries spent more than $1.5 billion of investor money on politics over just a short period. Under the law we have right now, ordinary American investors have no way to know whether the companies they own were a source of that money. That would be less worrying if executives' interest in political spending were aligned with those of shareholders. But when it comes to politics, insiders' interests may diverge from those of investors. Political spending has consequences that goes beyond the company's performance, like advancing insiders' preferred political views, and executives' decisions may be influenced by those preferences. Now, the standard securities law solution to conflicts like this is disclosure. That's why SEC rules mandate clear disclosure of executive pay. That's why our rules also require companies to give investors detailed information about transactions between insiders and the company. And that's why the case for requiring disclosure of corporate spending on politics is so strong. Now, before joining the Commission, I led a bipartisan group of scholars who petitioned the SEC to develop rules requiring disclosure of corporate political spending. Since then, more than 1.2 million Americans have written to the Commission urging us to adopt those rules. And a bipartisan group of former SEC officials, including 2 former chairmen, have called our proposal a slam dunk. But because Congress has used the appropriations process to block the Commission from developing rules in this area, too many American investors today remain in the dark about how public companies spend their money on politics. I believe that a critical part of the SEC's mission is to make sure that ordinary investors stand on a level playing field in today's markets. Gaps in our securities laws that allow insiders to trade before key information comes to light, stock buybacks that maximize executive pay but not buy and hold investor performance, and rules that allow insiders to spend investor money on politics in secret undermine the trust that ordinary Americans have in our financial system. I am delighted that this committee is considering how best to close those gaps. And of course, on all these matters, I remain open to the views of my exceptional colleagues here on the Commission, and it is my great privilege to be a part of their work. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd be delighted to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Commissioner Jackson. Commissioner Peirce, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, it's an honor to be here today, and it's a particular pleasure to be here with my colleagues. We all share a common passion for the capital markets because we believe they have the power to unleash talent all across the country, and that's good for all of us. Under Chairman Clayton's leadership and with the help of our hardworking staff, we are applying this shared passion for the potential of the capital markets to change people's lives, to think through to collaborate and think through a wide range of issues related to protecting investors, facilitating capital formation, and protecting the integrity of our markets. I'd like to talk to you today about 3 principles that I apply when I do my job. The first is that investor protection means more than just protecting investors from fraud. It also means protecting their opportunities. The second is that while enforcement is an important part of our mission, regulation is the key part of what we do. It's our first step, not our last step. And third, we as regulators don't and we can't know everything. Investor protection is, of course, on our minds in everything that we do. One of the key purposes of the securities laws is to make sure that investors get the material information they need to make decisions about where to invest their hard-earned money, and they often do that with the help of a financial professional. Our Office of Investor Education and Advocacy helps investors navigate the complex financial markets, and through our compliance and enforcement programs, we make sure that institutions and individuals involved in our markets are doing their roles in a way that benefits investors and the markets. Our role is not to make decisions for investors. Investors, if provided with adequate, clear, and truthful information, are best suited to make choices about which investment products serve their own particular needs and goals. When we place unnecessary limits on investors' opportunity to buy products, we risk substituting our own judgment for that of the investors. Overriding investor preferences about how to spend their hard-earned money is not investor protection. This principle has informed my views on digital assets, retail access to private markets, and retail access to different types of investment financial professionals and investment products. Regulatory flexibility and the attendant ability to respond to investor demand is key to making sure that investors get what they want and need. My second principle is that the SEC is a regulatory agency, not an enforcement agency. Of course, we bring enforcement cases when people flout our rules, as we should, but enforcement is a poor way to announce policy. We need to be clear in writing our rules, and we need to make sure that we provide the guidance that firms and individuals need as necessary. We understand that our rulebook is complicated, and we work with well-intentioned firms and individuals to help them comply with our rules. My third principle is regulatory humility. As I said, we can't and don't know everything. We draw on the talents and expertise of our staff, and we also look outside the building. We have a number of advisory committees that we rely on to advise us on a number of issues. We also hold roundtables with industry and investor representation to talk about pressing issues of the day, and we also have investor town halls where we go out and we meet with investors. We also look to our fellow regulators for their expertise. I, for example, am working on the security-based swap regime, trying to get that up and running, and we've been working very closely with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in making that happen. We're also looking at our rules all the time to see what needs to change. Sometimes we need to write a rule to to codify exemptive orders that have been issued for a long time, or maybe the staff has been doing something by no action letter, and we're going to adopt a rule to put a more permanent framework in place. I think regulatory humility comes into play in all of these things. We always need to be asking if we're doing things right. I think one area where I'd like us to take a second look, to take a step back and look, is the consolidated audit trail. I just want to ask whether it's right for a government regulator to collect all of the purchase and sale decisions of every retail investor in the United States, regardless of whether they're accused of any wrongdoing. So with that, I just want to thank you for the chance to be here today. I look forward to your thoughts on what we can be doing better, and look forward to your questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Peirce. Commissioner Roisman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm honored to appear before you with my fellow commissioners. This month marked my 1-year anniversary as a commissioner, so I'll use this opportunity to share some of my reflections on the past year. I've often said that the U.S. capital markets are the envy of the world, and the importance of the SEC's role cannot be overstated. It's truly a privilege to go to work every day with the dedicated and hard-working staff of the Commission. They embody and deliver on the SEC's tripartite mission to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. Protecting investors is front of mind for me as I dedicate time each day to reviewing potential enforcement actions as well as potential rules. Our written testimony provides more detail, but I am consistently impressed by the matters the staff presents to the Commission with protecting investors in mind. I think it's important to note that all of our divisions and offices, and not just enforcement, are working to protect investors. For example, the SEC's Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations has been instrumental in conducting exams in high-risk areas across the industries we regulate. Not only have I seen them spot and refer potential securities law violations to our enforcement staff, I've seen them help us get ahead of such violations by directly engaging with the SEC registrants and publishing materials that all compliance professionals can use to do their jobs more effectively. The Office of Investor Education and Advocacy has also played an important role in protecting investors through their bulletins, videos, and outreach events. I've been particularly impressed at how all of the Commission's divisions and offices have worked together to address an area that I care deeply about: elder investors. As one example, next week, staff from across the agency will host a roundtable on elder investor fraud with experts from the private and public sector. I look forward to joining the SEC staff at this event and engaging with everyone on how we can better identify, prevent, and combat fraud targeting elder investors. With regard to maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, I take this part of our mission very seriously. Market integrity is a priority for me, not only with respect to our equities markets, but for our fixed income and treasuries markets as well. In this area, I greatly appreciate the work that our Division of Trading and Markets has done to closely assess how these markets are working, whether they work as intended, and where there is room for improvement. Outside the secondary markets, the Division of Investment Management has also done impressive work to streamline and improve regulation of important segments of the asset management industry through which U.S. retail investors are increasingly accessing securities markets. With regard to the final tenet of our mission, encouraging and facilitating the entrance of companies to our capital markets, especially small businesses, is incredibly important. I appreciate that for the past year, the Division of Corporation Finance has been working hard, hosting roundtables, soliciting comments from the public, recommending rules to facilitate issuers' ability to conduct registered public offerings, lower their cost of capital, and provide Main Street investors with more investment opportunities. I believe their participation is a necessary component of successful capital markets and one that has been a hallmark of our markets since their inception. It's also a reason that countless Americans have been able to save for retirement, pay for school, and deal with unexpected financial inflection points in their lives. I'd also be remiss in not mentioning my interest and appreciation for this Commission's focus on the proxy process, which I believe is a fundamental aspect of our capital markets. In closing, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you some highlights from my first year as an SEC Commissioner. Your oversight of our agency helps us operate at our best, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Roisman. Commissioner Lee, you are now recognized to present your oral testimony.
Thank you. Chair Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm roughly 2 months in to my term as a commissioner at this point, and it has been a privilege to work with my distinguished colleagues here and with the dedicated staff of the SEC. Having served at the SEC for over 13 years prior to my appointment, I have experienced firsthand and developed a deep appreciation and respect for the commitment and dedication of the staff to the mission of the agency. I can say that from my vantage point as a commissioner, that respect has only increased as I have met and worked with dozens of dedicated staffers in each of the divisions, people who have developed extensive expertise through years of day-to-day hands-on work with investors and other market participants. I'm inspired by their commitment, as well as that of my colleagues here today, and I'm more determined than ever to do all that I can to help the agency do its part to protect and strengthen the economic well-being of Americans and American businesses. Although we deal with a large number of often highly complex issues and rules, from market structure to cybersecurity, they should all be viewed and analyzed through this lens. Whether and how they will promote and strengthen the economic well-being of everyday Americans, saving to buy a home, to send their children to college, and to eventually retire, and American businesses, which need a fair marketplace with clear and manageable rules to facilitate growth. This committee has identified a number of critical issues for discussion today: the increase in the amount of capital raised in private versus public markets, the importance of ensuring that public companies disclose in the most effective manner possible the information that investors need to make informed decisions in an era where business models and the relevant risks to those models are changing, the SEC's enforcement program and its ability to get money out of the pockets of fraudsters and back into the hands of their victims, digital assets and cryptocurrencies, and the role of financial intermediaries in our markets. With all of these issues, it is important for the SEC to be held accountable by the investing public, by those we regulate, and of course by this committee and by Congress. Whether we're making changes to the staff's longstanding review process for shareholder proposals, assessing the fiduciary duties of investment advisors with respect to proxy voting, or considering how best to modernize and strengthen public company disclosures, we must be fair and transparent about the policy choices we make and the data and information on which we rely in making those choices. I thank the committee for its interest in and oversight of these important issues, and I stand ready to answer your questions and listen carefully to your thoughts and concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Lee. Chairman Clayton, you are now recognized to present your oral testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And I want to echo the thoughts of my colleagues on the opportunity we have to testify today, and also just note that their testimony demonstrates the wide range of issues that the Commission deals with every day. I want to thank this committee for your support of the Commission, and in particular the dedicated women and men who are our most important asset. The funding that you provided to us for fiscal year 19 allowed us to lift our hiring freeze and make new hires in critical areas, including enforcement and examinations, market oversight, cybersecurity, and small business capital formation. I'm pleased to report that we have filled approximately 100 new positions with high-quality individuals that I expect will serve American investors very well. The fiscal 19 funding that you provided us also allowed us to continue to make significant investments to and upgrade and otherwise improve our IT infrastructure, cybersecurity, and risk management. We've made progress in these critical areas. However, our information technology needs and the related risks are ever changing, And let there be no doubt, substantial work remains. Turning to our mission. For me, the interests of our long-term Main Street investors are front of mind. I believe our 4,300 colleagues share this perspective. I want to highlight just a few examples of the recent work of the Commission in this regard. Starting with our Division of Enforcement, I note our Teachers and Military Service Members initiatives, which focus additional enforcement and investor education resources on behalf of teachers, veterans, and active duty military personnel. Unfortunately, these hardworking Americans are too often targeted and fall victim to fraud, shady, and self-serving practices and other misconduct. My message is simple. If you're ripping off teachers, service members, or veterans, we want to catch you, we want to punish you, and we want to get them their money back. Returning funds to harmed investors continues to be a priority for me and the agency. I previously testified about challenges, including legal impediments we face in obtaining funds from bad actors in cases with long-running, well-concealed frauds, such as Ponzi schemes. I want to recognize and thank this committee for its bipartisan work to address these challenges. Enhancing Main Street investor protection while preserving and improving access to investment opportunities also has been a priority. In June, the Commission adopted a long overdue package of rules and interpretations to require candor and impose other responsibilities on broker-dealers and investment advisors and their dealings with our Main Street investors. As a result, for the first time, regardless of whether an investor chooses a broker-dealer or an investment advisor, the investor will be entitled to a recommendation that is in the investor's best interest and does not place the interests of the firm or the financial professional ahead of the investors. This strong rulemaking package was informed by the Commission's expertise and decades of experience regulating, inspecting, and bringing enforcement actions in this space. It also benefited from unprecedented direct shareholder engagement, including 7 town hall-style investor roundtables held across the country. We are already seeing the benefits of this work. We are also focused on the implications for Main Street investors of the substantial changes that have taken place in our markets over the past 2 decades. For example, 25 years ago, the public markets dominated the private markets in virtually every measure. Today, the private markets outpace the public markets in many measures. However, in our private markets, Main Street investors, 1, typically do not have the same access to investments as sophisticated professional investors, and 2, where they have access, they typically do not have the same alignment of interest with sophisticated professionals as they do in our public markets. In response, we continue to explore initiatives to increase the attractiveness of our public capital markets as places for companies to raise capital. At the same time, we are also exploring whether we can increase the type and quality of opportunities for Main Street investors in our private markets while maintaining appropriate investor protections, including aligning the interests of Main Street investors with professional investors. In closing, I want to refer you to our written testimony, which details a number of the risks that we are monitoring along with our fellow U.S. regulators and regulators around the globe. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Clayton. I'm going to deal with 2 issues here as I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. First, I want to deal with insider trading. I'm going to you, Commissioner Jackson. Current loopholes in the law allow corporate insiders to enrich themselves at the expense of their shareholders. For example, there's evidence that insiders are misusing SEC Rule 10b-5 1 to engage in illegal insider trading by changing their trading plans. My bill, the Promoting Corporate Standards for Corporate Insiders Act, would require the SEC to study this apparent misuse and amend its rules accordingly. This bill passed the House on a broad bipartisan basis. Can you please discuss why it's important for retail investors and market integrity for loopholes to be fixed? Do you agree that the Promoting Transparent Standards for Corporate Insiders Act is a common sense fix to the apparent loophole in Rule 10b-5-1? Insider trading has been a problem historically. What do you think?
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Waters. First of all, I want to thank you and this committee for focusing on this important issue. You know, Rule 10b-5-1 was adopted some time ago, and it's always a good practice for us to dig back into our rules and see if they're serving their intended purpose. That rule was intended to allow insiders to make trading decisions long in advance, not based on any particular timing. And there is some academic evidence to the degree that they're taking advantage of investors. So I think studying this subject makes a great deal of sense. And again, without commenting on any particular legislation, I'm glad this committee is focused on this issue.
Thank you very much. And now, but Chairman Clayton, as we have discussed, I'm extremely concerned about Facebook's planned cryptocurrency, Libra, and digital wallet, Calibra, and their potential impacts on investors, consumers, and the American financial system. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, Federal Reserve Chairman Powell, and even President Trump have raised similar concerns. Just this month, regulators from France and Germany both agreed to block Libra from their countries. In a joint statement, the two governments stated that, quote, no private company can claim monetary power which is inherent to the sovereignty of nations, unquote. Can you please talk about the systemic risk and risk to investors that Libra, as currently described, would pose?
Thank you, Chairwoman. I'm not going to comment on any specific crypto asset, other than I will note that the attention that Libra has raised, I think, is a good thing. We're having these discussions, and regulators around the world are focused on it. But I do think that crypto assets, while they have benefits, including eliminating frictions and the like, can present a great deal of risk, particularly in cases where in form they are the same as securities or the same as currencies or they're the same as payment systems, but they're not regulated in the same way. We have developed what I would say is an ecosystem of financial regulation over the years, securities, commodities, currencies, payment systems, that deals with a great deal of risk to investors and risk to our markets more generally. To the extent a crypto asset would be used to evade those regulations, I have a real problem with it.
What are you doing now to take a look at Libra and Calibra? Have you set up a committee, a commission, an advisory group? Are you looking at it so that you can understand what those risks are?
Yes. We have a group at the commission that is focused on digital assets, both the potential they have to add efficiency, but also the risks they face. And look, we saw this in the quote-unquote ICO space. You know, $4 billion, pick your number, raised, most of it gone, not complying with our rules. You know, I think we had a great effort from our Division of Corporation Finance, as well as our enforcement division, to say, hey, if you're selling securities, you got to follow our rules. And we're gonna do the same thing across all digital assets that touch in the security
So you
space.
do have a committee of some sort that's taking a look at what is happening with the development of Libra?
Yes. Well, yes. All digital assets that come to our attention. Also say at FSOC, we're looking at digital assets in a more
What about the
holistic
entire blockchain phenomenon? What do you know about that? What work has been done on that? Is there an opportunity to perhaps brief the legislators on the work that you may be doing, both looking at Libra and looking at all of blockchain?
Be very happy to do that. I would be very happy to do that. I'd be very happy to do that with my colleagues at the commission. I can't speak for my other federal financial regulators, but jointly with them, happy to do it.
Thank you very much. I now yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, the ranking member, Mr. McHenry.
Well, why don't we start there? Mr. Chairman Clayton, why don't we start with digital currencies? That's where it's going to end. So, Chairwoman and I have a similar thought process on raising the question. Based off your current analysis of the Libra project, which is just an idea at this point, or white paper, Chairman Clayton, do you believe that Libra is a security?
I'm not prepared to make a decision like that here. We have to see how different assets function to decide whether they would be a security, a commodity, a currency, or not. But if what you're doing is using a digital asset to raise capital for a project with the idea that you're going to get a return as a result of investing in that project, sounds like a security.
Okay, so, but let's acknowledge there's a larger ecosystem to raise money globally outside the U.S. jurisdiction, right?
Yes.
So we need to have appropriate regulation, but too onerous regulation just drives off the innovation from the United States and the upside potential for investors. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I know, Commissioner Pierce, you've done a significant amount of work in this space. But for cryptocurrencies, we see that Blockstack had their Reg A offering approved. Now, walking through that process, Commissioner Pierce, do you believe we have a pretty solid ecosystem for cryptocurrencies to exist in the United States and to raise capital in a regulated environment?
I think we still have work to do to make sure that people can develop digital assets in the U.S. in compliance with our rules. I would like to see us be a little bit more forward-thinking in ways that we might accommodate unique aspects of digital assets. For example, digital assets that are utility tokens. I don't know that the securities law framework that we have right now is the appropriate framework for them, and so I'd like to see us think about creating some kind of a safe harbor. Again, the idea is to allow...
Is there current law for the SEC to write regs around that?
I think we have authority that would enable us to work on something like that. I still am giving it thought, but I think we do have authority that could allow us to do that.
Chairman Clayton, how would you respond?
We have a lot of discussions about this. I agree with Commissioner Peirce that, look, to the extent this technology facilitates capital raising, consistent with our investor protection, and I think it's been pretty good in the private space. I mean, I'd like to have more access for individual investors. If we can use it to have more access in a protected way, I'm good with it. And I'm good with exploring ways to do that. But what we saw in the ICO space was something that, I don't think anybody thinks that was a success.
Okay, so let's move to crowdfunding. I raised this in my opening statement. 11 pages of legislative text that we passed in a bipartisan way, not without dissenting votes, but we had fewer than 15 dissenting votes on the House floor, and bipartisan nature. So investment crowdfunding, regulation crowdfunding, such as the limits on individual investment limits, the total amount raised, and the overall goal of this. Is the SEC willing to...
All right, Asher, there we have it. I think that might be all we're getting about the digital asset space in this hearing today. Well, can you summarize what was said for us?
Well, look, there's some interesting points that were raised. Firstly, we had Maxine Waters coming out strong.
Right,
opening statement and ready to bring in his significant talk about Libra specifically. She clearly wanted to know about Libra, understandable given she sort of pioneered those hearings back in June.
Look like Clayton is playing ball.
No, certainly. He refused to speak specifically on any crypto asset, Libra included. She asked him whether or not he'd had they had an agency set up, a task force set up to deal with Libra specifically. He would not give a clear answer on that, but said they had groups looking into and investigating policies to be created in cryptocurrencies generally and the cryptocurrency space. Clayton, unsurprisingly perhaps, but not very positive. He said in his opening statements on the matter, cryptocurrencies can present a great deal of risk. He brought up repeatedly the 2017 ICO sort of craze and said that they have an ecosystem for financial regulation that deals with risks to investors and that cryptos need to fit inside that somehow. Yeah. Interestingly, though, he said, he treats it as an unregulated space. You think the SEC would be a prime organization to help establish some of that regulation, but clearly they don't want to necessarily pioneer that space, perhaps understandably.
He made a caveat, this is not a SEC meeting and nothing they say is considered SEC policy. All right, we're going to keep on listening here if they have anything else to say about cryptocurrencies, digital assets, but we're going to leave the broadcast for now. Asher Westrop-Evans, thanks very much for breaking it down. Those of you at home, you can check us out on blogtv.com for more crypto and blockchain news. Thanks a lot.
Welcome back to Block TV. It's time now for Suck My Blockchain, where every day our team members